Okay, you can see the first slide, just making sure. Dementia starts early in life. Can you see the slide?
Yes, it works.
Awesome. So yes, the brain is extremely special when it comes to omega-3. It has completely different mechanisms how to absorb omega-3, and the brain is made for life. And we're going to talk about all of these special mechanisms and details today in detail. And for some people, that may be a little bit too much, but I just want you to understand two main factors here, which is that dementia starts early in life and the baby's neurons are made for life. They do not get replaced. And if you are omega-3 deficient early on, you are on the path to dementia. And somewhere in midlife, obviously, this problem gets worse, and the existing neurons you have are shrinking and getting dysfunctional. But let's go into it. Basically, we know that the brain has 60% fat by dry weight. It's a computer simply made by lipids. Lipids are not just fat, so triglycerides are not lipids, and I talked about that in other talks in detail. Lipids make up your membranes and make life. And a gigantic portion of this lipid composition is omega-3, specifically DHA in the brain. So up to 230 grams of DHA in an adult brain, if you would isolate it and weigh it, that is a lot of omega-3. Newborns actually require up to 5 times the amount of DHA that adults do because their nervous system is still forming, and we know that the brain isn't finished until much, much later. And the newborns have up to 40 to 50% DHA in their brain fractions. So the absolute amount of DHA obviously increases as your brain grows, but the enormous need for omega-3 in an early developing newborn is really quite impressive. And I will talk about all of this in detail. So low DHA means simply you have weak neurons. Neurons communicate via synapses, and that requires flexible membranes. So it doesn't take a genius to understand that without a flexible membrane, or we often talk about membrane fluidity, you can't really make proper vesicles, and I will talk about all of that. So yes, inflammation in the brain is something that needs to be controlled instantly. It would kill us instantly. If you have inflammation in your gut, it doesn't kill you instantly. You can live with that. But in the brain, it would be extremely dangerous. And that's why we have such a large amount of DHA inside the brain, because DHA makes resolvins and stops inflammation. So you can't really expect the neurons to be healthy, though, at lower levels of DHA. And those neuroprotectants and resolvins really don't fix your brain anymore when you have DHA deficiency. And what that means, I will go into detail. So you need DHA to keep that inflammation in the brain at bay. And that is probably the driving factor for dementia. And I will talk about all of that in detail. Just stay with me. So here's the shocking truth. Neurons are built for life. You do not grow neurons. So liver cells divide constantly. Otherwise, we wouldn't survive a night in the pub. You have to make liver cells over and over. They're growing very fastly. Every organ regrows, some faster, some slower. Kidneys are very slow, if at all. They are the second most dangerous omega-3 organ that's affected by DH or by omega-3 deficiency. So neurons are built for life. So all we can do is keep them happy and functional. But again, I showed you the baby has a 5x need for DHA. So you better make them right away. And when you have a decline of omega-3 over decades, obviously that results in structural degradation of your neurons and your membranes, and your synapses weaken, and that means your connections in the brain, your network connections. We know very little of how the brain really works, and it's really all about connections, a fascinating topic for another talk. So just a reminder, this all starts with your cardiovascular system, and why we're doing this whole omega-3 process every single day, taking our shot glass. Only when your omega-3 is above 8%, you are in the safe zone. And somebody just actually gave me that little hint here, the zipper. Um, a lot of guys get it in their 60s and 70s, and you can avoid it. Just look at this. Once your omega-3 is 8%, you can avoid it. So what does that do, obviously, for the brain, right? It doesn't take a genius to understand that the brain needs a very good cardiovascular system and oxygen. Okay, let's get started with the nitgrits here. And basically, we have a very simplification of mechanisms here. Two proteins are essential to bring omega-3 into the brain, and that's this MFSD2A, very long name. I really could have made it a little shorter, but you can read the name here. Major facility superfamily domain containing protein. So that one basically brings the DHA into the brain. There's a special mechanism that does that. And that ensures a minimal function of the brain. And the brain always has priority. It always does. And it knows that if you are low on DHA, you are in big trouble. Your CPU will basically short out. Another protein here, the BDNF, is very important in the blood-brain barrier. And you can actually measure that protein. You can definitely have a better idea of what stage of dementia you are approaching. And I will get into that. So can you reverse all of this? Sure, yeah. Brain fog, inflammation, brain shrinkage. And there are many studies. So the list of dementia diseases is very long. And they all just fall under one category, in my opinion, which is omega-3 deficiency. So it doesn't really matter, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS. They're all just functional neuron problems. And obviously some diseases are systemic, MS and ALS. And some are more located in the brain. But in the end, this is a very omega-3 deficiency problem for all neurodegenerative diseases. Psychiatry really doesn't understand this. Your average MD psychiatrist doesn't even know his own omega-3 index. Yeah, so again, dementia begins early in life, and this is not a hypothesis. This now has robust evidence and lots of publications. So we need that protective role of omega-3 throughout life to reverse our dementia, which is inevitably coming at age. So brain's early life design is really about the blood-brain barrier, BBB, and how you efficiently absorb DHA. So that is so important for the mother, and we have tests showing how the mother becomes deficient because the baby reduces its own omega-3 status in the breast milk. If you feed a baby with cow's milk or supplement, whatever formula, there really isn't enough omega-3 in there. That's probably the main reason why breastfeeding is so important, apart from all the other growth factors and protective ingredients in the breast milk. And what does that do? Of course, it has a one-to-one correlation with the IQ status. That's a nice topic of a whole nother talk. So can't repeat it often enough. Already research shows, but by age 20, brain architecture is different. And you can see how the gray matter actually changes and shrinks. And this is directly related to poor maternal nutrition. And sure, there are many other factors involved in dementia, and you can study all of them, socioeconomic factors. But in the end, it comes down to nutrition and poor cardiovascular circulation. And again, your cardiovascular disease risk at 2 or 3% omega-3 is incredibly high. So yeah, you guys know this test. The mother previously balanced now is 40% DHA deficient in the last trimester because the baby wants to be at 0 DHA deviation, meaning everything goes to DHA, including the EPA in this baby gets converted to DHA. So there's no EPA inflammatory protection in the baby, and no mother and the baby are deficient. So this whole process then goes on over life. And this article very nicely invented this word, chronification of inflammation. So what does that mean? It's not chronic inflammation. Okay, so what? I live with chronic inflammation. No, you are actually making it worse. You are actively a participant in making this inflammation worse, and that is probably the decisive factor in a later dementia state. Yes, there are childhood risk factors and pregnancy factors. There are definitely socioeconomic issues working into the whole dementia process. But the physical state of the nervous system and the brain plays a very large role in this. Epigenetic modifications is a very interesting topic, probably a topic of omega-3 on itself. So we always talk about genes, and I have 4 hours, I think, on our autoimmune system. There really isn't an genetic autoimmunity. This is all about which genes you turn on and off. And that, again, is a factor that plays into the nutrition of the mother. So very simple example here, microglia are the inflammatory cells in the brain. They're highly controlled because obviously you do not want to have inflammation in your brain, only if you have a severe condition. So it's the same thing as your regular macrophages. You need to shift that M1 to M2 population that I've talked about many times. So omega-3 is the shifter. Omega-6 makes M1s with TNF-alpha and IL-6 being the main culprits here. Eicosanoids resulting in cytokines that are shifting to inflammatory populations. And that's, all very good, except, if you have an injury, if you have a bloody stick in your leg in the forest, you better have inflammation control with M1s, but not after 24 hours. It should be resolved. And this is a big problem in the brain. If you don't shift to M2s with TGF beta and IL-10 and BDNF, no, talking about that later, you're in big trouble. And that's why the brain always has priority, and it has a much higher omega-3 content than the rest of the body. So not having omega-3, loss of membrane fluidity, no receptor signaling. It's all about the membrane function. And then no anti-inflammatory mediators, resolvents, and so on. Yes, okay. So where does that come from? We know it comes from massive amounts of omega-6, and you'll see that omega-6 actually inhibits the omega-3 uptake in the brain. So that results in mitochondrial dysfunction, no ATP, no aerobic. Brain needs aerobic energy. I'll talk about that. And inflammation, I talked about that already. The neurotransmitters then affect everything in your body, right? So once the brain, there's a lot of glands, right? A switchboard for computing input-output signals into hormonal signals. That is, the reason for your aging brain, the decline of your blood-brain barrier permeability, and I'll show that in detail here. And the transporter protein with this long name is actually downregulated, and it declines over age. And there's some genetic components here. I won't go into that, but I will show you how the DHA content actually matters, and your brain shrinks without it. So there's a competition here between omega-6 and 3. And when you have 30 to 1, as we show in our tests, you are basically screwed because, it just, imagine you have 30 bad guys knocking at your door, the blood-brain barrier at any continuous diet. That one guy trying to get in that saves your inflammation can't get in, right? It's completely wrong. So when you are at 7 to 1, that is very, very few of us starting out at that value. You're basically in a much better position, but still not good. So you need 2 to 1, right? So there's evidence that high omega-3 actually inhibits DHA absorption in the brain. And so here's the graph, the same one that I showed for cardiovascular. And it's not quite the same as cardiovascular effect, but you can definitely understand that this is a more complex problem than simply looking at your heart attack rate. Just simply measuring dementia is not that easy. But these modern studies now, they just look at genetic markers or simply divide people into quintiles, meaning, what's your highest and what's your lowest. And you can see in the studies that 6.1 is the highest, but nobody's even close to 8, right? It's modern diet impossibility to get to 8. That's why we need to supplement. That's why we need large amounts of very high quality omega-3. When you start at 2%, you need even a higher amount to get there, right? So this is a very interesting double piece of information, right? So nobody is at 8, but if you go to 6%, right, your hazard ratio for um, basically memory loss in this case and other dementia factors is half. So it's not zero, but it's half. So I would expect this if you had a study from birth to, um, I would say age 50 would be good enough. And that person would be at 8% from birth to age. I would expect this to be zero. Really, I would. So we're just, kind of guessing here. But this is a significant effect, right? There's no questioning that this data is real. And we're not supplementing here. This is just dividing people into quintiles of their omega-3 in later stages of their life, right? Not even in early stages. So this is, a measurement of how your omega-3 index causes a very direct one-to-one correlation of your brain size. So 3.2% higher omega-3 index, which we know is a lot, right? So when you start out at 2%, going to 5.2% takes a year, 2 years for some people, right? And only very few people can actually do that. So you are basically measuring a huge effect of brain shrinkage in the hippocampus in this example here. So they actually equated this to 2 years of brain aging prevented for 3.2%. It's kind of a weird number, but since nobody is at 8 or 10%, we don't really know if you can actually prevent brain aging by 100 years, right? So we measure omega-3 in red blood cells, RBCs, which is a bit of a problem here because it doesn't necessarily correlate how much DHA is in your brain and how much can cross the blood-brain barrier efficiently. So you have to understand, and I'll get back into that in detail, is that DHA does not cross the blood-brain barrier through the normal lymph mechanism. The absorption of omega-3, I had a talk on that last time, requires the lymph system. That is not how the brain absorbs DHA. It actually goes through the blood via LPC DHA, and I'll go into that in detail. So if you actually just measured THE, DHD, triglyceride DHA, right, you can't really understand how the brain absorbs. And you would have to measure LPC DHA, which isn't easy to do, and nobody does that. But what you can do is that you can actually measure the second protein I mentioned, the BDNF. I'll show you again later how it actually works. And then you can understand how the brain absorbs it and how your hippocampus increases with that larger amount of LPC DHA. So again, the point here is that you need that lipid-bound DHA to cross the blood-brain barrier. Your normal lymph TAG DHA does not do the trick. So you can measure circulating BDNF protein. It is definitely measurable in the serum blood, and low serum BDNF has been observed in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and so on. So there's another negative feedback here and another vicious cycle. So the less omega-3 you have, the less you can absorb, the less you actually even bring into your gut, right? That's what I talked about last time. The less BDNF you make that's functional, the less that will go into your brain. So it's a vicious cycle. And it's a predictive factor for cognitive decline. So is this blood test done? No, it's not. So we really need that LPC panel. So again, the DHA is bound to um, a very different lipid, lysophosphatidyl and not triglycerides. In the mechanism is quite complex, but it literally travels in your HDL uh, cholesterol particles. So that's why this whole discussion on cholesterol is such a joke, right? Not only do you need massive amounts of cholesterol, but you also need massive HDLs to circulate omega-3 into your brain via the LPC. So read the title here, right? Role of circulating LPC in neuroprotection against Alzheimer's. So this is the root mechanism here, right? So it affects the blood-brain barrier, it affects the MFSD2A, and it affects the BDNF. And that's, really not rocket science. And you can measure all of those, but who does that, right? So we're gonna get into detail here how DHA is actually essential for MFSD2A. And when you knock it out, so you guys know what knockout mice are. Basically, you have, a genetic mice that can't make it. And guess what? They have leaky blood-brain barriers, no neural function. The microglia, the M1 population gets activated, right? So massive brain inflammation. And yeah, that results in cognitive deficits, right? Poor mice, but those experiments are decisive when it comes to science. When you knock out something essential, then you really know its mechanism. And what does the DHA really do in terms of blood-brain barrier? Same as in the gut. It basically is needed for occludin, clodins, and ZO1. These are tight junction proteins, and tight junctions are the same or very similar in the gut as they are in the blood-brain barrier. Without DHA and actually EPA for that matter, you can't make proper tight junctions. So there's another link here for your gut-brain axis, right? It's so simple. No tight junctions, no barrier, and then you have 30 omega-6s knocking at your door. So yeah, DHA suppresses neuroinflammation. I talked about that a long time ago. The resolvins are, so you have to understand that EPA makes prostaglandin 2 series, okay? These are directly opposed to series 3 eicosanoids from arachidonic. That is the most important general immune mechanism, and the EPA is extremely important in regulating inflammation at its first step, which is eicosanoids, and that's why ibuprofen works on omega-6, right? Because it just simply stops the inflammatory eicosanoids, IL-6 and TNF-alpha. And then you are basically going down to DHA, and it makes resolvins and maresins and protectins, and they are, anti-inflammatory, but at a different mechanism, not exactly related to the eicosanoids, but more important so in the brain and in resolving inflammation over, a long-term or a traumatic effect, very important. So both have a little different function when it comes to regulating inflammation, but bottom line is here again, DHA deficiency disrupts the blood-brain barrier. And your BDNF and your MSSD2 do not work properly. So here's the blood-brain barrier. It's not something that's like one barrier up to the brain. It's in every blood vessel and the neurons, and supporting cells are attached to the blood vessels. And you can see the tight junctions then between those. So normal blood vessel basically has very good tight junctions, and it's protected from the inside out. Really don't want to have that systemic inflammation leak into the brain cells. And that's what the blood-brain barrier really is for. Among that, it filters out many other nutrients and topic for a whole nother talk, drugs and so on. So basically, you are in a state where that blood-brain barrier needs to be intact in order to really combat proper inflammation. But what does it comes at a price, and the price is that you can't get omega-3 into the brain, into the neurons, only via those two transporters that I've mentioned. So when you basically have proper omega-3, you enhance that mobility of the receptors and transporters. And again, general cardiovascular state matters, right? Your arteries in the body are like concrete at 2% omega-3. The same is true for your brain, right? And that also disrupts lipid rafts, very important in the fluidity of the brain. Also a very fascinating topic by itself. And we know that lipid raft disruption is a big factor in Parkinson's. So yeah, is that all reversible? Sure. So you keep your neurons happy and you can reverse it. Again, they're made for life and they may shrink and they may actually die to a certain amount, but you can make them happy again. Since we really don't use very much of our brain at all. My own dad basically had a serious skull fracture. He was gone, literally. They cut him off life support, and he had to relearn everything from scratch. That was a very devastating process to observe for me, but it taught me something, is how powerful the brain really is. At age, how old was he? Not that old, 60. He relearned everything from going to the bathroom to walking to everything. And that's what kind of taught me, is that you use very, very little of your brain. And it's really all about the mitochondria and the detox process, and that all starts in the gut. And you can reverse degradation of your brain state. At least you can halt it, but it all depends on how much DHA are you going to get into the brain, right? So back to this slide here, low DHA, loss of membrane fluidity, and high inflammation. In the end, you will be talking about how much mitochondrial action do you have to keep your neurons happy. So yeah, so the brain needs aerobic energy, which is special, right? So, the whole body can live on ketos. I mean, on a non-glucose state, the brain can't do that. So that's why you actually make glucose in your liver, gluconeogenesis, which is dysregulated in the diabetic 2 state. So it's actually a liver disease, not a pancreas disease. So the brain requires 120 grams of glucose per day. So for whatever reason, obvious reason, it needs massive amounts of computing power, requires electrons. Electrons go through the electron transport chain in your mitochondria, and that makes 32 ATP versus only 2 ATP anaerobic. Plus, you don't want all of those lactate problems in your brain, right? So that's why the brain requires glucose and a lot of it. So you can definitely get into a coma easily if you are hypoglycemic. And that is, also, there's probably, I didn't pull up that study. There's probably a correlation of diabetes and dementia. Yeah, so when you are fasting, you make ketones, and the famous keto bodies keep your body running. They are made from fat. So you just chop down your fat. Fat has massive amounts of energy, seven to at least I think it's seven times for, glucose. And then it enters the transport chain in the same way as sugar, citric acid cycle, and makes your energy. And it's a very efficient process. It just takes a little longer, and it takes a while for your body to start that starvation process because, if you have enough carbs, why bother? And you really want to preserve your fat for the next starvation period. So ketones give you a really good bright state. That's why when people start fasting, they report this clarity in their head, and they are actually neuroprotective, and they reduce reactive oxygen species and suppress inflammation. And that's why you feel so good when you fast. And they are getting transported across the blood-brain barrier. Um, yeah, so basically, ketone bodies are a really good invention. So the more you reduce your carbs, the better, but you can't really do this forever. After a while, you get deficient. I'll get to that. So, how are the blood-brain barrier properties enhanced by omega-3? Um, Neural signal transmission, I already mentioned. You have faster receptors. Those receptors only compute signals from your gut, from your Chinese medicine. We often talk about the five elements: heart, the liver, the spleen, the kidney, and the digestive organ basically send signals. And the brain doesn't really have any function other than it's a switchboard. But, it better work properly. And that requires very efficient ion channels. So, the signal propagation in your neurons is a pre-established ion gradient, and then the channels open, and then that travels along your axons until it reaches the synaptic vessels, and they, release the um, synaptic message to the next cell, and that's how it gets propagated through the brain. And you need optimal vesicle fusion for that, and that requires a very fluid membrane. So again, but it's not just about that fluidity. The DHA plays a huge role in cytochrome C in your mitochondria, in your electron transport. When DHA is deficient, your mitochondria die. The cytochrome C simply can't live without it. And that is your main ingredient in making ATP in the mitochondria. Yeah, so that's called apoptosis, right? The cells simply die when your mitochondria die. So when your power plant is done, your cell is done. So mice with DHA deficient diets showed blood-brain barrier disruption and increased permeability. In the hippocampus, blood-brain barrier breakdown has a direct link to cognitive decline. And, the DHA, as I explained, is the main player in this. So you can restore that blood-brain barrier. So unlike the neurons made for life, obviously, the blood vessels and their integrity can be replaced. And that's a very good thing to know, right? So yeah, when you feel clear in your brain on fasting, the effect is through omega-3, not necessarily through the ketones. I mean, they do give you good energy, and you definitely have an advantage for a short time. But the mechanism really is it's mitochondrial fuel. So the BDNF gets upregulated. So then now you have more DHA coming to your brain. The brain knows there's something special happening now, so I better be aware and find out where I can get the next food from, right? Inflammation goes down and epinephrine goes up, giving you a fight or flight. So the brain benefits from ketones are more ATP, clearer thinking, mental sharpness. And so you can definitely do intermittent fasting, or you can fast for 36 hours, or even a week. If you're really overweight, you can fast for 25 days, but after that, you'll get deficient. And you really have to watch out that you're getting your omega-3 into your brain, and that may stop after a certain while. And then you become lethargic again. So you have to actually go through a cycling process. I'll talk about that. Yeah, so here it is, right? Alzheimer's and insulin resistance are related. So this is actually a fascinating topic too, because when you're insulin related, you're actually making a lot of ketones. So it's like a, you know, process gone wrong. Yeah, there's something in that. So you can't do keto forever. You definitely need glucose, and your brain simply only lasts so long on this kind of starvation stress mode. It puts a lot of stress on your body, and that's how you lose weight, right? Stress is good, but you need to cycle through it, and so intermittent fasting is the best way of doing this. I have a procedure for that. You can contact me. It's really not rocket science. It's actually easily doable, especially if you go to my talk on fats themselves, part 1, the medium chain fatty acids and so on. So yeah, you can do intermittent, or you can do short-term 36, 48 hour. Those actually have a better effect for most people because it's hard to go through an intermittent. But in the end, you do need carbocycling. So um, you can't build muscle by just doing keto. You need carbs to wake up your mitochondria because it adapts after a while. And that's, not good brain food. So there's a process, and your body will tell you that. So um, you can kind of tell, like when the weather gets colder now, you're craving way more carbs, right? I mean, your body needs more energy. So just, if you listen to your body, you can go through this carbocycling, intermittent fasting process much easier. And there's a lot of nutrition in carbs. They're not just, you know, empty fuel. And we know that we need fiber, and those are carbs, right? All of that is important. So here it is, the blood-brain barrier, and your MFSD2A sits in it and wants to bring that LPC-DNA molecule through to the brain. So that is a special LPC DHA, not your average DHA floating in your lymph system, as I explained in my last talk. So when you have absorbed your omega-3 in the micelles after you made your bile and your vesicles, only then you can absorb it. It then enters the lymph system and gets eventually back cycled into every cell in your body through the vena cava into the venous system, and then obviously back into the arterial system, a process that ensures that even interstitial tissue gets omega-3, but not the brain. The brain is different. It has a special transporter, and it needs to import LPC DHA, which is totally different. So simply taking more DHA is not enough, and it must be in the right form. And I showed you earlier that you actually really would have to measure these two. This one probably difficult to measure, but the BDNF and then you can measure the LPC-DHA, right? That would be ideal. So it's not passive diffusion into the brain. That's what I'm trying to tell you here. Lymph diffusion is passive mostly. It's very, very slow, very inactive. And it's good because, it can basically take its time. The brain doesn't have that kind of time. So that LPC-DHA actually is made. It's not just uh, present in the diet. So there's a process here involved. And then you basically put it into the HDLs, and they circulate with albumin um, or other lipoproteins. And that needs to go through the blood-brain barrier then, right? And for that, you need these two transporters. And the blood is really where that action is, making that LPC, phospholipase A2, and then makes it accessible to the brain pool. So, yeah, I hope you got the message. Totally different mechanism, fascinating. And this is the protein. Doesn't look like anything special, just your average helical transmembrane protein. Probably a very fascinating talk as how it actually facilitates that diffusion into the blood-brain barrier. Mechanistically, DHA is needed for this process, and this is always what the vicious cycle is doing in itself, right? When you are deficient in DHA, you can't turn on your enterocyte, you can't turn on your digestion, you can't even absorb the little omega-3 that you have. So it's a vicious cycle all over again. Yeah, I'm beating this to death. This is, picture of your neurons, and they are heavily dependent on DHA. Fascinating cell, right? I mean, they can be extremely long, but basically they receive messages in the synaptic cellular extensions here, then propagated through the axons. And these are the myelin sheets, right, protecting the channels and so on. And then it goes to the next efferent synaptic message to the next neuron, right? So there's a lot of stuff that has to happen, and a lot of repair that has to happen. There's a lot of receptors, there's a lot of nerve cells that are involved in this process. It is not a simple process. And it's really just shockingly, I don't know how to, I'm not finding the right word for this, how this cell can be made for life. It's just, I don't understand how it can survive 60, 100, 150 years. Right? We used to live 600 years, allegedly. So yes, neurons are made for life, but that doesn't mean you can abuse them, and you need to keep them happy. And the breakdown of neurons is a silent process, takes years and years and years. But it starts early in life. The worse you're starting omega-3, the worse you're ending. Probably going exponential then at the age of 70, when the dementia starts setting in. Once it's advanced, the chances for reversing dementia are very, very difficult, and probably has to do with the actual ability of actually learning, relearning. So you can restore your neurons even at advanced dementia, but then you still have to relearn everything, right? And that process requires a little more effort than just taking a shot glass of omega-3 per day. So what are the core symptoms of brain fog? Of course, you start not being able to focus or attentive focus. That's why we watch 12-second videos now. Anyways, short-term memory lapses. So that doesn't mean you can't remember, what you just did 30 seconds ago. I love to play Heyday. And so in Heyday, you have to kind of make things in a, let's say you make a sack of sugar, which you need to make a cake, right? And so then, you have to feed these um, customers. And so you have to memorize very short, a list of like 20 things that you have to make. So now you go back to your machines, which are about probably 30 or 40 of them. And most of the time I remember half of them, right? And it's a lot of visual things too. So you can like which visual part of the production chain do I need to make this next product? Um, that helps, but it takes actually a while for your very short-term memory to commit to real memory because the brain needs to sort out what's actually important, what's not important. And is it really important that I make this sack of sugar right now? Probably there are more priority issues because we can only focus on so many tasks at once. So, and that's, the very short-term memory, that is pretty much a lack in most people. But you can train it. Like I said, I train it in the Heyday. And then the longer or medium-term losses are really devastating, right? If you can't remember what you had for breakfast. And most of the time, the earliest memories go lost. So most Alzheimer's patients and so on can remember very early things. And it's extremely difficult to function if you can't remember, the name of your son or anything. So, that is all related to omega-3 deficiency, low DHA, as I explained in this talk. It's mostly about regulating your microglial M1 population, no aerobic energy, no brain function. Those neurons are a sucker for ATP. Then you can't release neurotransmitters. And, it's not a surprise that in these dementia diseases, you have low dopamine, right? So, I mean, Parkinson's really starts out as an essential tremor. It's just a dysfunction of the cerebral. And you can treat those early on. Once you take dopamine, guess what? Your gland gives up. It said, you don't need me anymore. So in 10 years, the supplementation of a Parkinson's patient with dopamine ends up to be at the exact dyskinesia as the person who didn't do anything. So that is not a treatment. And taking hormones is very, very dangerous. You need to train your glands to make hormone. And how do you do that? You do that with omega-3. Insulin resistance, the linkage of gut-brain. We talked about this tight junction in the gut, the same as in your blood-brain barrier. And those are all seen in early Alzheimer's, and the studies are out there. And that's actually called type 3 diabetes now. So yeah, it's all about the blood-brain barrier dysfunction and the availability of LPC, DHA, and the availability of a certain form of DHA that can make it into your brain, which can be measured, but never are. So, the priority of the brain again, uh, I will show you in a picture in a second here, but you can kind of understand it's all about membrane fluidity and how you need to make a huge curve to make flexible vesicles, right? And that all activates ion channels and receptors. And none of this can happen without DHA in rigid membranes. So, I mean, what is a rigid membrane? The membrane is actually a complex um, form of lipid rafts in a rigid mass. So you need both. You need stearic acid and you need your flexible lipid rafts. The lipid rafts are actually protein omega-3 conglomerates, right? So they're like literally functional rafts. That's why in my book I have this picture of Huckleberry Finn on his lipid raft and floating into the river. So, the float doesn't mean anything without the river, and the river doesn't mean anything without the float, right? So you need both. So DHA creates a permissive lipid environment. Permissive meaning that it's a dynamic state where both interact, the lipid raft protein omega-3 with the actual saturated fat. And that's what makes, synaptic signaling possible. And so that's why I say here your brain needs to get the curve. So those synaptic vesicles are very, very curved. They are extremely small and they require very flexible DHA, more likely on the inner membrane, just like at the mitochondrial inner membrane. And then your vesicles and their contents can actually function and do their job. Yeah, so the brain is intact, it's just starving. So neurons are made for life, but you need to keep them healthy. So with omega-3, the brain thinks faster, your mood improves, and who hasn't noticed that being at 10% DHA, which I hope you are. I'm actually plus in the DHA. It's actually way easier to make DHA than EPA. We know that, right? Um, so EPA is still very important, but your brain requires DHA. Yeah, so when your mood improves and you can think more level, um, it's kind of like a buzz, right? Your vibrations enter alpha state more easily. I just published my book on alpha acupuncture. We are mostly in a state of fight or flight, which is beta, very erratic brain waves. It's in my book. And you can get into alpha using meditation or acupuncture, some semi-meditative state. And when you are in alpha, you basically are much happier. It doesn't take a genius to understand that when you're in a fight or flight mode, it's way easier to trigger an emotional response than when you're in an alpha state, right? And the hormonal signals coming from your body, from your brain, I'm sorry, hippocampus, it's pituitary, you name it, are very, very important in that process. So, and they don't work without omega-3. So yeah, brain turnover of DHA luckily is very slow. Um, it's kind of a mystery how it can be that stable for that long in the brain. And I have to actually really burn this down into the actual studies and how they measured this. It's absolutely shocking to me, 2.5 years. So, but again, once a cell is made, it's very difficult to exchange its membrane. So your best bet is to have a good stem cell, right, in your liver, of which you have a huge decline. And that's why we have stem cell therapy, You are basically incorporating omega-3 in that stem cell to begin with, right? And then you have a good new organ that can basically hang on to the DHA. So there are mechanisms to transport omega-3 into an existing cells. There's actually enzymes that flip omega-3 lipids back and forth, but that process is, not as efficient as making a new cell, right? And so that's basically why DHA is so slowly exchanged in the brain. So when we get to balanced in 6 months or a year in our RBCs, that doesn't mean anything for the brain. This process may take, 5 years, 10 years, right? So don't give up. Most people notice cognitive improvements after 6 months, but this process may take many years, and it all depends on your metabolism and how much LPC-DHA is available. Another summary here, can't summarize enough. Neurons are made for life, but membranes are not, right? So that's basically what I just told you, is neurons constantly replace fatty acids, very slowly though, in the brain. And there's mechanisms that establish, the repair of the neurons and to ingest newly arrival of DHA, but not when there's 30 omega-6s knocking at your door, right? It doesn't work like that. Yeah, and the memories then can reshape, can actually really undergo different forms of it. And that's what cancer is basically. It is a misshaping of the membrane, and they expose different lipids to the outside. That's well known. And basically influence the immune system and shut it off that way. There are probably, many different variations of the different brain cells, which I didn't get into today. The differences between astrocytes and neurons and so on. I'm not a brain physiology expert by any means. And they probably have different ways of absorbing DHA faster or slower. But in the end, it's the same process through the MFSD2A or the BNDF. Yeah, so rebuilding your brain requires large amounts of omega-3. We have non-rancid omega-3, you all know that. You need a high dosage. When you start at 2% omega-3, that may take a long time. The lower your dosage, the higher, the lower your starting value is, the longer your projection and the more dosage you need to have. But can you absorb it? And that's another process. Your digestion needs to be fixed first. But the target is 8 to 12% for neuroprotection. And nobody has that, right? As we've seen earlier, 6.1% is max upper quintile. So aerobic exercise helps. Hormesis, so when you kill cells, your body starts to wake up and exchange and wake up its stem cells. Meditation gets you into the alpha brain state. Acupuncture does. Sunlight's good for you, very good for you, especially there's, receptors inside the brain. You need to activate those every day, and that's probably the main reason for winter depression. And yeah, I mean, you can read through this. There's a reward system that comes with the whole upregulation of BDNF. And eventually, maybe you become a more curious person. There really isn't any intelligence, and now that we have AI, that's all going to level out to the same amount because everybody has access to the same amount of information. in the past, you had to be really, really good at filtering out information in a record speed. I spent hours and hours in the library with zero results. No, takes seconds, right? But what you can't do is you can't learn curiosity. They actually say you're born with that. So that's what, is, in my opinion, intelligence. And your quantum brain basically is required a certain amount of physiology, but in the end, it has a lot to do with how curious you are. And, frankly, most people just in and out, and that's the reason why they don't understand how important omega-3 is. It goes in for a short amount of time and it goes out again. So it's our job to remind them over and over and over. And the synaptic formation, the neural repair, the long-term memory, and all of that can be changed with omega-3. And you can definitely revive other neurons that are sleeping. So that's why I gave you that example with my dad. You know, you can learn everything from scratch again. But for that, you have to activate new neurons. And that is a process that, doesn't necessarily only require omega-3. It requires a certain amount of curiosity and a certain amount of input and output that has to be achieved. So many people say you can't really learn anything unless you touch things. So touching a keyboard doesn't count. So you really only learn this as a pen by touching it multiple times. And then, you can do this with your eyes closed, right? For example. Yeah, a very fascinating topic, how the brain works. Low BDNF is linked to depression, Alzheimer's, brain fog, autism, right? Our kids are in a devastating situation now. We are testing worse and worse and worse early on. Obesity, direct link to diabetes 3, right? Gut-brain axis, all of this explained through omega-3 and those two proteins, MSFD2A and BDNF. So I already talked about this. Sedentary behavior is not hormesis. You do need to rest. You need to repair. You need good sleep. Good sleep is not come by easy. There's nice apps on your phone, which even if it's off, measure your REM cycles. If you have no REM cycle, you're in big trouble. So high sugar definitely suppresses BDNF. So you need to restrict your sugar and do intermittent fasting. You need to go into keto every once in a blue moon. And you'll feel so good because your brain will be clear, right? So these are all factors influencing these proteins that are directly involved in omega-3 absorption. And then omega-3 can do their job, right? Yeah, the mechanism goes through this protein called CREB. It's well proven. So, how omega-3 not only keeps the BDNF happy, but also is required in the signaling process to make BDNF. The learning demands BDNF because it demands a lot of synaptic action. So what is learning? We're basically making new connections. So, like I said, you use all of your brain, but you use none of it, a very small percentage of it. So, I mean, it's just there's connections made all over the brain, and we can establish, centers for hearing and seeing and so on and so on. There's connections made, right? And when you learn, you make those connections, and that's basically all we know about the brain. Um, when that gets disrupted, like in the case of my dad, you have to relearn. So you can teach yourself anything to a certain degree, I would say. I'm still trying to learn the guitar, but it's a matter of how much time you put into it and that finger memory, right? So, if you touch that string 1,000 times with that one finger, then you learned it and that connection is made, right? Hormesis is the trick to change things. And in the case of the brain, obviously there's no hormesis in the brain, but it likes the keto bodies, as I explained. So yeah, that crap protein is a signaling protein, and it basically is the pathway for your neuronal plasticity, learning, and memory, ultimately making BDNF, which then can absorb more DHA. And that is the synaptic plasticity cycle here, which backfeeds, right? That vicious cycle I'm talking about. You end up either in a down spiral or you end up in an up spiral, and then you can learn, and then you can make things that you've never thought were possible. Studies show that DHA enhances synaptic plasticity via CREP. So, you know, there are probably more proteins involved in this whole process, but I'm trying to burn it down to the minimum. But that's your mechanism, and it's published, and the science is there, and you got the knockouts mice. So I'm not making this up, right? That's my point here. So bottom line, stay in alpha. Uh, my book is available on Amazon. Um, Alpha is the key, and there's mechanisms to learn. There's mechanisms to achieve new states, and then you can actually absorb more DHA into your brain and be on that upward learning cycle instead of the downward dementia cycle, right? Meaning dementia can be reversed. Do I have another slide? There are other nutritional supplements here that are so important. Selenium, I just learned, very important for certain epigenetic certain diseases require a lot of selenium, and our extent may not have enough of that. Most of them are probably enough in this area. Zinc, obviously, you can up to. Iron, you can't absorb. Copper is enough. Magnesium, you need way more. So if you take 2 extends and 2 xenoshine per day, that's not enough magnesium. Yeah, and we test and we know what we're doing. We're steering towards a DHA quantum brain. This is the cycle we would like, right? Supporting LPC DHA supports your liver, supports your immunity, supports getting rid of omega-6. And don't forget, no matter how much omega-6 you eat, no matter how much omega-6 knocks at your door, you can just simply shove it out. If you add just 5 more omega-3 guys knocking at your door, you can shove out those 30 guys easily. And that's what the body does. And, the science shows that. Cool. I think that's it. So, you want to end here? No, thank you. Not me. 15 years, Reagan, 15 years. Yeah, not a pretty side, right? Can you stop it at that advanced? No, probably not. Not with what they have anyways, right? The clinical implications of testing are clear, and you guys know all about that. Early screening, early omega-3 index, 1.3%, devastating. And that's the end of my presentation today. Thank you very much. Any questions?
One question, Hans. Thanks a lot for this interesting talk. How can we improve this conversion into LPC-DHA? So you said phospholipids, take more phospholipids together with the balance oil. What do you suggest?
That's a very good question, and I do not have the answer on hand. Um, so I think it's a normal process if you have enough cholesterol. It's all about those circulating HDLs. They automatically make that lipid. So once that lipid um, has enough exposure to uh, the omega-3 absorbed, right? You can definitely, and that's probably happening inside the enterocytes as well,
Okay.
because so that the chylomicrons are getting repackaged, right? And then they are getting shuttled out to various sites. So not all of them go through the lymph. So
Uh-huh.
they get packaged into those VLDLs and so on,
Okay.
which
And
have,
probably the microglia cells and the inflammation in the whole body, which immediately affects the glia cells, the microglia cells in the brain. So probably that's another aspect that has an influence there.
yeah. So basically, um, it all starts at your digestion and the functionality of
True.
your enterocytes.
Yeah.
I would say once you absorb omega-3 properly, there should be plenty of LPC DHA
Oh, that's
available.
great.
Yeah, but I don't have the exact answer to that.
But
Yeah,
that's a good. We
awesome.
orbit and our index is quite good. So then there we have, it's very likely that we have enough LPC DHA.
Um, yeah, I think if you are in the positive with DHA, you can definitely assume that.
Mm.
Um, but again, the all the dementia studies are not done properly, right?
Sure, sure.
Um, they're very inadequate. Um, when you look at heart disease, it goes to zero, but when you look at dementia, that's a whole nother animal.
Yeah,
So
sure.
again, I would say that if you have 10, 20 years of proper omega-3, you should not ever, I mean, your chance of dementia should be equally low, calling, few percent or zero
Mm,
compared to cardiovascular. That's just my take on it.
yeah,
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, guys, for listening to the strong talk, and I'm happy you made it out today.